The anime begins by showing us a boy reading a story in which a legendary wizard faces the Demon King, and after a long battle, the wizard manages to defeat the great villain, causing the boy to desire to become a wizard after reading a book. After the scene, we are transported years later to the kingdom of Alzano, which has a dangerous academy in the city of Fiji. There, we see a girl named Cinee running, and as she does, she begins to greet her friend named Rumia, as both plan to meet to go to the academy together. They head to school while talking about a teacher who recently resigned, leading to a new substitute teacher. However, their conversation is interrupted when a man appears running in front of them, causing Cinee to use magic to stop him. After this incident, we see the man is the protagonist named Glenn Radars, who starts acting cool in front of the girls. Cinee apologizes to him, but he laughs, attributing the incident to her. However, he stops when he sees Rumia's face, questioning if he has seen her somewhere before. Cinee gets angry and uses her magic against him again before leaving with Rumia. Later, the two girls go to their classroom where they wait for the substitute teacher of Class 2, and the protagonist appears, introducing himself as the new teacher, surprising Cinee and Rumia. On the other hand, we see a teacher named Hallie arguing with the director, disagreeing with the protagonist being the new substitute teacher because he is a low-ranking mage and little is known about him. However, the director mentions they accepted him based on Celica's recommendation, a powerful mage and teacher of the academy. Hallie remains unconvinced, and Celica appears, threatening Hallie for speaking ill of the protagonist, as she has known him since he was a child. She assures the director she will take responsibility for the protagonist's performance. Later, the protagonist tells the students they can do as they please and then falls asleep, making Cinee angry and throwing a book at him when he wakes up reluctantly. He begins teaching begrudgingly, and the students notice his handwriting is illegible, making it difficult to understand what he writes on the board. A girl named Lynn asks him a question about magic, but he admits he doesn't know the answer, surprising everyone. The school bell rings, and the protagonist leaves the classroom happily. Later, Cinee is in the cafeteria with Rumia, revealing her desire to study hard to solve the mystery of Melgarius Castle, located in the sky, as she promised her late grandfather to explore it for him. The protagonist interrupts their conversation, teasing them, which angers Cinee. Before he can do anything, he interrupts her, giving her some of his food and then eating Cinee's food. In a scene change, Celica is observing the academy while thinking about the protagonist, and we flash back to a few months ago, where Celica forces the protagonist to be the new teacher of the academy, despite his reluctance. After a flashback, we see the protagonist still being lazy in class, angering Cinee, who threatens to report his behavior to her noble family. The protagonist gets excited and asks her to do it, surprising Cinee, who then challenges him to a fight by throwing her glove at him. The protagonist accepts, and they go to the academy's courtyard, where Cinee tells him if she wins, he must take his job seriously, to which he automatically agrees. They decide to use only one spell called Shock Bolt, and they prepare to cast their magic. However, Cinee manages to cast her spell first, defeating the protagonist. And after this, the protagonist tries to use his shock bolt again, but Cinee intercepts him once more, causing everyone to think that the protagonist is truly weak. He then admits defeat, but tells Cinee that he doesn't remember betting anything. The next day, we see the protagonist still not taking classes seriously, and then Lynn asks him another question about magic. However, Cinee tells her that she doesn't ask the protagonist for help since he doesn't understand the greatness of magic. This causes the protagonist to ask what benefits magic brings to humanity since fields like medicine or science can cover what magic does. Cinee tries to defend her stance, but the protagonist interrupts her and tells her that magic is only useful for killing. He begins to explain how useful it is for ending someone's life, angering Cinee, who hits him and then leaves the classroom while crying. After this, the protagonist starts reflecting on his attitude on the academy rooftop, but then he notices that Rumia is inside the laboratory. So he decides to go to her and asks her to continue with the development of the magic circle she's creating. However, Rumia tells him that she doesn't know how to make it work. The protagonist tells her that the circuit requires a lot of mercury to function, so he grabs some from a container and pours it onto the circuit. This causes Rumia to get excited as her circle starts working, and in that moment, the protagonist starts seeing himself reflected in Rumia. After this experiment, the protagonist starts talking with her. She asks him what he did before becoming a teacher, to which he replies that he was unemployed for a year and doesn't want to talk about his past. Rumia then asks what he did before that year, and the protagonist says it's not worth discussing his past. He then asks Rumia why she's interested in magic, and she tells him that she wants to repay a favor as she was kidnapped years ago and saved by a powerful mage. Hearing this, the protagonist starts reflecting on the use of magic. The next day, we see him apologizing to Cinee, telling her that his attitude was not right. After this, the protagonist decides to teach Class 2 how to use magic correctly since he realized they were using magic in the wrong way. He uses Shock Bolt as an example and explains that the way they cast the spell can affect the final outcome. After showing them several examples, he tells his students that magic is about studying the heart and mind and how they can influence the use of magic. He then shows them that he can use Shock Ball using just one word, surprising everyone. After this, he tells them that the books they have been using are only for memorizing magic, but mentions that they should understand magic before memorizing it. Then, days later, the protagonist starts becoming increasingly popular in the academy, so several students from other courses begin attending his classes. After finishing his day, the protagonist goes to the rooftop of the academy and starts thinking that teaching isn't so bad. Celica appears and congratulates the protagonist on his progress as a teacher, and the protagonist apologizes to Celica for causing her worry, causing her to smile. Celica tells him that she must attend a meeting with all the staff, so the protagonist's classroom is the only one open in the academy since they must have extra classes. The next day, we see the protagonist arriving late to give his classes, but on the way, he realizes that someone is following him. He asks the strange person to show themselves, and Karel, a criminal, appears, attempting to assassinate the teacher. On the other hand, Class 2 is waiting for their teacher, but two more criminals appear, led by a man named Ray, who starts asking for Rumia. After getting her, they decide to take her with them and use the rest of the students as hostages. On the way, we learn that Rumia is actually the princess of Alzano, who supposedly died many years ago. On the other hand, one of the criminals stays alone with Cinee, planning to abuse her. But then the protagonist appears, and upon seeing him, the criminal tries to assassinate him with his magic, but his magic dissipates instantly, causing him to be surprised. The protagonist explains that he possesses a unique ability called the World of the Mad, with which he can seal any magic within a certain area, mentioning that his ability also affects him. Then, the protagonist begins to strike the criminal using the army martial art, easily overpowering him, revealing that the protagonist can defeat Karel with his fists before even reaching the academy. Later, he defeats the delinquent who tried to abuse Cinee, and after this, he communicates with Celica, revealing that the criminals belong to an organization called Divine Wisdom, who turn out to be evil mages. Celica mentions that they currently cannot do anything as the Divine Wisdom sealed the academy, leaving the protagonist completely alone. Then, several skeleton soldiers summoned by Lake appear, eliminating the delinquent who was on his side. Upon seeing this, the protagonist and Cinee begin to flee from them. After getting away, the young man asks his student to prepare a spell against the soldiers, so Cinee uses a gust magic to stop them. The protagonist then begins to prepare a powerful magic called King's Extinction, releasing it, destroying all the soldiers and part of the academy in the process. However, the protagonist is left in a bad state since he used magic that his body cannot withstand. Before he can do anything, Ray enters the scene, and the protagonist asks Cinee if she can use a spell against Lake's weapons, to which she responds that she needs time to recover her strength. The protagonist decides to push her into some bushes to fight alone, and their battle with Lake begins, where both start to display their abilities to end the fight quickly. Then, the protagonist tries to use a spell to stop Lake's swords, and Lake tries to stop him, but the protagonist deceives him, receiving the attack head-on. Cinee appears and uses her ability to undo Lake's spell, giving the protagonist the opportunity to attack him with one of his swords, defeating him in the process. Lake remembers who the protagonist is, revealing that he is a mage killer who works for the Empire. After mentioning this, Lake dies and the protagonist falls unconscious from losing a lot of blood. Cinee tries to heal him using magic, and after several hours, the protagonist wakes up, noticing that Cinee is unconscious after using all her power. The protagonist decides to go look for Rumia on his own and, after several minutes, arrives at the tower where she is. There, it is revealed that the person behind all this was Huey, who was the teacher who gave the protagonist his position. Huey mentions that he has just created a magic circle that will teleport Rumia to his base, but the protagonist decides to use his blood to break the circle, destroying all the layers of the spell, but he runs out of mana upon reaching the last one. However, Rumia manages to reach out her hand, touching the protagonist, revealing that Rumia is an amplifier, allowing her to increase the power of the person she touches. The protagonist gains enough strength to destroy the magic circle. Afterward, he approaches Huey and punches him, defeating him, thus ending the conflict. The protagonist reunites with Celica, who reveals Rumia's true identity, but the protagonist is not surprised to hear this. Days later, we see how the students of Class 2 gather to discuss the magical competition, an event where all the courses compete in different sports. The protagonist appears, mentioning which sport each student in his class will participate in, as he knows the strengths and weaknesses of each of them, causing the students to trust their teacher even more. However, the protagonist only wants them to win for their own benefit, as the teacher of the winning class will receive a monetary bonus. Later, at sunset, Class 2 begins to have a discussion with Class 1 in the courtyard, as both decided to practice in the same place. So the protagonist decides to interrupt the fight, and then Hallie appears, telling the protagonist that Class 1 will win the event. However, the protagonist decides to bet 3 months' salary on the winner, to which Hallie automatically agrees, causing the protagonist to become increasingly worried about the event. He starts training his students for several days, teaching them how to use their abilities to win the event. The day before the event, we see Rumia on the balcony of her house holding a necklace, a memento from Queen Alicia. Cinee appears, revealing that her family adopted Rumia, so Cinee's parents treat her like another daughter, wishing them both luck in winning the competition. The next day, Queen Alicia heads to the event, wearing the same necklace as Rumia. However, her servant, Eleanor, offers her a different necklace, which Alicia decides to wear for the event. After the ceremony, the magical competition officially begins, with Class 2 gaining several points in different sports. Meanwhile, we learn that Celica and Alicia are old friends, so Celica talks to her informally during the event. After several challenges, Rumia decides to participate in the mental defense game, where a count named Zest uses magic for the participants to defend themselves. After several minutes, only Rumia and a Class 5 student named Jail remain, and he uses his mind break spell, causing Rumia to kneel. However, he becomes unconscious after the attack, making Rumia the winner of the mental defenses, which makes Alicia proud of her daughter. Meanwhile, a guy and a girl named Albert and Rel observe the protagonist from afar, as they seem to know him well. It's revealed that they are there to guard the queen. In another scene, the students are on break, and Lynn asks the protagonist for advice on transmutation magic. So, the protagonist transforms into Rumia to advise his student. Then, Cinee greets the young man, mistaking him for Rumia, and the teacher pretends to be a student to try the snack Cinee offered. However, the real Rumia appears, causing Cinee to realize the protagonist's true identity and sends him flying with her magic. After a few minutes, Rumia appears in front of the protagonist and gives him a snack prepared by Cinee, which the young man happily eats. At that moment, Alicia appears before them, surprising the protagonist, as he worked for her a long time ago. Alicia tries to talk to her daughter, but Rumia says she got the wrong person, so he runs away from the park. Alicia asks the protagonist to protect Rumia, then returns to the stadium. However, she encounters Commander Silos and his troops, who order the soldiers to detain Alicia for a moment. On the other hand, the protagonist meets Rumia, revealing that they tried to kill her years ago because of her power. He tells Rumia that Alicia always cared for her, suggesting they go talk to her. Suddenly, Empire soldiers appear, claiming to execute Rumia for attempting against the queen. They knock out the protagonist and tie Rumia to a tree to eliminate her. Suddenly, a blinding light appears, and the soldiers are defeated one by one. It turns out the protagonist knocked them unconscious and then flees with Rumia. Once in a safe place, the protagonist contacts Celica, who says she can't do anything because Eleanor placed a special collar on the queen, which could kill her if they rebel against her. The only way to undo the spell is to kill Rumia, so the protagonist is currently the only one who can save the queen. After talking to Celica, Albert and Rel appear before the protagonist, and Rel attacks him, using a sword, so the teacher starts to fight her, but at that moment Albert interrupts the fight by hitting Rel, and after this, the protagonist begins to scold her, and there we find out that Albert belongs to the court, which is an organization that serves the kingdom where both the protagonist and Celica took part years ago, and after talking for a while, the protagonist asks his former companions for help, so both of them agree to help him, so the protagonist and Rumia continue to escape from the Queen's guardians. Meanwhile, Albert and Rel decide to return to the stadium, and there the class 2 tells them that from now on they will be in charge of guiding them to victory, and in this way, we see how the students of the second class start to win one by one the games, which causes them to be tied with the first class in the first place, so everything is decided in a final duel where Cinee takes care of fighting against her opponent using magic, and after a few minutes, she manages to defeat him, causing class 2 to win the competition, and after this, Albert and Rel approach Alicia to receive the medal, but then we find out that they were actually the protagonist and Rumia transformed, and there we see how Albert and Rel acted as decoys to allow the protagonist to approach the queen, and then Celica creates a barrier of isolation so that no guards can get close to them, and there Alicia asks Zealous to kill Rumia, which causes her to start crying, but then the protagonist realizes what is really happening. So he attacks and knocks down Zealous, and then Alicia gets rid of Eleanor's collar since the protagonist managed to deactivate the curse using the Mad World. And after this, Alicia hugs Rumia and apologizes to her, and then reveals her true feelings, causing Rumia to accept her, and on the other hand, Albert and Rel manage to find Eleanor, revealing that she belongs to the Divine Wisdom. But before they can do anything, Eleanor escapes using her magic, thus ending the conflict, and after this, the protagonist meets alone with Rumia, and there we find out that the powerful wizard who saved Rumia in the past was the protagonist, since the queen asked him to save her daughter when she was kidnapped, and then the protagonist and Rumia arrive at a restaurant where all the students are celebrating their victory, but the protagonist realizes that they spent all the money they had earned recently, so he feels sad. The next day after the competition, the protagonist and the girls meet Rel, and there she mentions that from now on she will be Rumia's new bodyguard, so she decided to infiltrate as a new student in the protagonist's class, so later he presents her to all her new classmates, and there we see how Rel tries to adapt to her student life since she is only interested in protecting the protagonist and living for him, but after several days, she is managing to forge a good friendship with Cinee and Rumia, so the teacher is happy for her, and after several days, we see how class 2 prepares for a field trip where they will visit the alchemy laboratory in the Ionia Islands, and upon arriving on the island, the protagonist comes across a strange vendor who turns out to be Albert, and there he mentions that he is the Real Guard of Rumia, and after saying this, he asks the protagonist to be careful with Rel since she can be very dangerous, but the protagonist doesn't pay much attention to that, and then we see how the class starts to have fun on the beach, and there the protagonist plays with his students, spending a good vacation together, and then at night Rel meets with the protagonist, and there she asks the teacher why he resigned from the court since she only lives for him, and upon hearing this, The protagonist gets angry with her, causing them to argue, and their Rel starts to feel jealous of Cinee and Rumia since she thinks that the protagonist abandoned her for them, and after a few seconds, Rel leaves crying from the beach, causing the protagonist to feel bad for her. And the next day we see how those from class 2 head towards the laboratory, but on the way, Cinee mentions the name of the protagonist, which causes Rel to get distracted and trip, and seeing this, Cinee and Rumia try to help her, but Rel asks them not to touch her, and she gets up on her own, while telling them that she hates them and they're the protagonist. Mentions that she is upset because of him, so he apologizes to both of them, and after this problem the class manages to reach the alchemy laboratory, and there they are received by the director called Burks, who starts to give them a reminder to the boys and then explains to them that their laboratory is responsible for experimenting with life itself, and for that reason, they investigate how to combine plants and animals to create chimeras. But upon hearing this, Cinee and Rumia begin to talk about the research on reviving people, which was put aside as it was impossible to achieve, and their Burke mentions that's why they decided to work on the revival life project, which is based on cloning a deceased person through their genetic code in addition to needing an astral code and an alterator. And there the protagonist mentions that the project was also discarded because it required the lives of many people to carry out. And after this, Cinee asks Burke what else he needs apart from the 3 main elements, to which he responds by saying that he needs an original magic which very few people in the world possess. And after this excursion, the students return to the hotel. However, Rel goes to the beach, and there she starts crying, but then a guy named Rainer appears who reveals himself to be Rel's older brother, which surprises her since she thought her brother had died years ago. And on the other hand, we see Albert spying on Rel, and seeing her with Rainer decides to interrupt the meeting, but then Eleanor appears, who introduces herself to prevent Albert from doing anything reckless, so both start fighting using their strongest spells, and during the fight Albert realizes that Eleanor is a very dangerous magician, so he decides to eliminate her instead of capturing her. And back with Rel we see how Rainer starts manipulating her, and there he asks her to kill the protagonist and capture Rumia since he is currently the slave of an organization, so if what Rel does what Rainer asks her to do she can be free. But then the conversation is interrupted by the protagonist, who exposes Rainer by telling him that he is a member of Divine Wisdom. So he decides to defeat him, but then the protagonist is impaled by Rel's sword, who thanks him for everything and then bids him farewell, leaving the protagonist totally mortally wounded. And minutes later we see how Cinee is about to enter her bedroom, but then she realizes that Rel is there covered in blood, and there Cinee realizes that Rumia is unconscious, so she tries to stop Rel, but in the end, she stops because she starts feeling scared, so she allows Rel to take Rumia with her. And after this Albert appears with the protagonist agonizing, and there he asks Cinee for help to save him, so he starts creating a spell while Cinee applies breath to the protagonist. And after a few hours, the teacher wakes up and there Albert explains everything that has happened, revealing that Burks was working with Rainer and with Eleanor in the process. And after this Albert gives his old revolver to the protagonist, and then both decide to go rescue Rumia. And in a scene change, we see how she is imprisoned, and there Burks reveals that he plans to use Rumia's original magic since he plans to use the revival life. But then Eleanor realizes that the protagonist and Albert arrived at the base since Albert placed a locator on Eleanor before she escaped, and seeing the Burks decides to summon his chimeras to take care of them. However, Albert and the protagonist manage to defeat them easily, and seeing that his defenses couldn't do anything, Burks decides to go and defeat them on his own account. And on the other hand, Eleanor asks Rainer to take care of this since she is leaving the base. And then we see how Burks meets the protagonist and Albert, and there he transforms into a giant chimera, and there Albert asks the protagonist to go ahead since he can take care of defeating him on his own. So the protagonist manages to get ahead and reach where Rumia is, causing her to be happy to see him, but then Rel stands between the two of them since she is willing to protect her brother. And seeing this, the protagonist tries to reason with her, but Rel ignores him and decides to attack him, so the protagonist starts dodging her attacks, and then Rumia asks her to stop, which causes Rel to hesitate for a moment, and thanks to that the protagonist takes advantage of Rel's doubts and asks her if she knows her brother's name, causing Rel to start doubting again since she doesn't remember his name, and then the protagonist takes the opportunity to give her fighting strength using his revolver, and then immobilizes her with a gravity spell. And at that moment Rel begins to remember her true origin, revealing that she was the first successful experiment of revival life, being the clone of a girl named Alicia who had an older brother named Shaun who were killed by Rainer. Since Shaun planned to stop the project with the help of the protagonist when he was a soldier, and after this we see how the protagonist arrived late at the laboratory. So he could only save and take care of Rel, and after remembering his past, Rel begins to cry, and then the protagonist tries to eliminate Rainer using a spell. But then Rainer is saved by 3 copies of Rel which were created without any emotions, so they try to assassinate the protagonist and Rel on orders from Rainer. But the protagonist begins to defend himself with his magic and then tries to reason with her, telling her that she now has new friends and a new reason to live, causing Rel to stand up again, and after this, she begins to eliminate all her copies one by one, and on the other hand, we see Albert starting to use his fire magic against Burks, reducing him to ashes after seconds, and then we see how the protagonist uses the world of madness, nullifying any spell from Rainer, and thus manages to defeat him in a single blow. And after the battle in the laboratory, everyone returns to the island safe and sound, and there Cinee receives Rumia and Rel, forgiving her for her actions and accepting her again as a friend, and after that, everyone returns to the city. And there we see how Rel starts living in Cinee's house with Rumia, where she begins to be treated kindly by Cinee's parents, so Rel tries to adapt to her new home, and the next day we see how Cinee goes to the library to study about the Megalius castle, but then the protagonist appears who thanks her for saving her last time, but then Cinee begins to blush after remembering the kiss she gave to the protagonist, and seeing this Rel gets upset with the teacher because she thinks he did something bad to Cinee, so she starts chasing him around the school, and during the chase, the protagonist trips over a carriage, but before being run over by its horses, he is saved by a spell which was cast by a guy named Laos, who introduces himself as a new teacher at the academy and Cinee's fiancé, since they promised to marry when they were children, and after this Laos starts praising the protagonist, since lately he has become famous for his teaching methods, so he invites him to his class as an auditor, and once there the protagonist realizes that Laos teaches very well, but also notes that his methods can be dangerous for his students, and at the end of the class, Laos invites Cinee to speak alone, and there Rumia asks the protagonist to accompany her to spy on them, and then we see how Laos starts talking to Cinee in the academy courtyard, and there he offers her marriage officially, but Cinee rejects his offer since she doesn't want to give up the dream of exploring the Megalius castle, and then Laos tells her that dream is impossible to achieve, and there he mentions that her grandfather could have achieved many things in the world of magic, but he didn't because he followed the path of magical archaeology, and for that reason Laos asks Cinee to leave that idea aside. However, the teacher comes out of his hiding place, and there he tells Cinee to do what she wants, and seeing this, Cinee decides to lie to Laos by telling him that she is the protagonist's girlfriend, causing the two teachers to be surprised to hear this, but then the protagonist starts playing along, and seeing Laos's attitude, the protagonist decides to challenge him to a duel by throwing down a glove, to which he accepts without thinking twice, so the protagonist decides to meet with his students to explain his situation, since Laos decided that the duel would be a battle of magical bodies, in which their classes would face each other in groups, so the protagonist decides to train them all to win the duel, and tells everyone that he wants to win to marry Cinee and not have to work anymore since she belongs to the nobility. And after class, the protagonist meets Albert in a bar, and there Albert warns him that a drug called angel dust is being distributed in the city, which causes people to become puppets that can be controlled by someone else, and upon hearing this, the protagonist is surprised since he believed that the distribution of the drug had ended many years ago. And after his meeting with Albert, the protagonist begins to remember a girl named Sarah, who was a former court companion who decided to support the protagonist with his dream of becoming a vigilante wizard. And after this, we see how the day of the duel arrives, and there the second salon represented by the protagonist and the fourth salon represented by Laos meet, and then Holly begins to explain the rules of The duel mentioning that the team that takes the enemy base or defeats the representative will win the duel, but also tells them that the battle will only last 3 hours. And that's how the duel begins, where we see that Class 4 starts defeating several of the protagonist's students easily as Laos asks them to use a quite effective strategy, so Laos starts to trust himself. However, Class 2 starts grouping into pairs, and each of them begins to counterattack, showing that the protagonist already has a plan to stop Laos, and then Rel appears, who starts easily defeating several opponents. On the other hand, the protagonist begins to provoke a group of students from Class 4, causing them to follow him into a forest where they start falling one by one into several traps the protagonist had left, and after this, the battle starts to even out. However, the 3 hours complete, so the duel ends in a tie, and upon hearing this, the protagonist congratulates his students for their performance, and on the other hand, Laos starts lecturing his students, so the protagonist decides to intervene. And then Laos decides to challenge him to a duel again by throwing his glove at him, to which the teacher accepts completely determined, but then Cinee hits the protagonist because she thinks that both he and Laos are treating her as if she were an object. And after this, Rumia decides to talk to Cinee, and there she tells her that the protagonist would not marry her just for money, causing Cinee to rethink and try to talk to the protagonist, and on the other hand, we see how Laos meets with a guy named Jadis, and there he starts talking about his goal of marrying Cinee and eliminating the protagonist as he wishes his family to gain more power to ensure his position as the next leader, which causes Jadis to start laughing. And then in a scene change, we see the protagonist at the academy, and there he starts thinking out loud, mentioning Sarah in the process, and then Cinee appears, who asks the protagonist who the girl he just mentioned is, and then asks him why he challenged Laos, to which the protagonist tries to deceive her, but after a few seconds, he reveals to Cinee that she looks a lot like Sarah, and there he tells her that when he was a child, he wanted to do justice, but seeing the harsh reality of the magical world, he decided to abandon his dream, causing him to start hating magic, and then he explains that he decided to continue his path thanks to Sarah's support. But then he tells her that she died on a mission where he couldn't protect her. So at that moment, he decided to leave everything and become a bum, and then he mentions that he challenged Laos because he didn't want to see someone give up their dreams, as he somehow would prevent him from losing his hope, and in that moment, the conversation is interrupted by Laos, who tells the protagonist that he knows his past, so the teacher threatens him and tells him not to say another word, but Laos ignores him and reveals that the protagonist's nickname at the court was the Madman. The protagonist decides to attack him, but Laos stops him using a military martial art, which surprises the protagonist, and after this, Laos summons beings called tulpas which start to hurt the protagonist, and after leaving him on the ground, Laos asks the protagonist to leave, so he gets up and leaves the place completely defeated, and then Leo grabs Cinee and forces her to marry him because if she doesn't, he will reveal the secret of Rumia and Rel to the entire empire, which would put both of them in danger, so Cinee is forced to accept, and the next day we see how Laos is waiting for the protagonist to have his duel. However, the teacher does not show up, and then it is revealed that he has not attended the academy for several days. So the marriage between Laos and Cinee will take place officially. So, days later we see how the wedding between them begins, and their Cinee begins to remember Laos' threats, so she decides to accept him as her husband. But when they are about to kiss, the protagonist appears, and there he throws a smoke bomb with which he manages to grab Cinee to escape together, and as he does so, he asks Rel to protect Rumia, which she immediately accepts, and once they are in a safe place, the protagonist explains to Cinee that he was absent, revealing that he was preparing to confront Laos and win, and at that moment, several infected people start to appear due to the angel dust, and on the other hand, we see how in the church there were also several, but Albert along with 2 members of the court appear, and together they start to take care of the infected, and in a scene change, we see how the protagonist starts to get upset, and there he remembers his last mission with Sarah in which they were fighting several infected by the angel dust, and being so Many they couldn't against them, which caused Sarah's death, and upon remembering this, the protagonist decides to get serious and starts killing all the infected, which causes Sistine to be afraid. But then Laos appears, who changes his true form, showing us that he was actually Jadis, who tells them that the real Laos died after consuming angel dust, and seeing him, the protagonist asks Sistine to run away because they don't belong in the same world. So Sistine starts running, and there we see that Jadis is a former member of the court, and he tells the protagonist that he is in search of the Akashic records, which offer the power to rule the very principles of the world, but for that, he must defeat the people he considers a threat within the empire, so he decides to eliminate the protagonist using his tulpas, so both start fighting, but then the protagonist is wounded, causing Jadis to have the advantage. But then Sistine appears and saves the protagonist, and there she tells him that she wants him to be the teacher he used to be, which causes the protagonist to reflect, and there he asks Sistine for help to defeat Jadis together, so they start fighting as a team. And there Sistine starts to eliminate the tulpas while increasing the protagonist's strength with magic, and so the teacher manages to deliver the final blow to Jadis, defeating him in the process. However, Jadis decides to flee using a spell. And after this, the protagonist notices that Sistine is completely exhausted, so he decides to carry her, and then we see his classmates appear, and there the protagonist asks Sistine if she really wants him to continue being her teacher, to which the girl replies yes, completely sure, and after the final showdown, the protagonist returns to the academy, and there he crosses paths with Celica, who tells him that they will leave for a few days to explore a site, so he will be alone at the academy. But then Sistine, Rumia, and Rel appear and call the teacher, so he goes with them to give his class, causing Celica to smile, seeing that the protagonist is very happy, and after this, the protagonist starts a new class with his students, and so the anime ends. And that's the end of the summary of this wonderful anime. I hope you liked it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button, as it helps and motivates me to keep creating more content for you. See you soon.